The most powerful empire invaded Earth. It turned into the worst mistake in space history. The metallic floor plates of the flooded compartment fractured with a low, tearing screech of metal. Fleet Commander Vex lost his footing as the deck tilted, his 6 upper limbs clawing at the rusted support beams to stay upright. Beneath the widening split, the dark water did not fall. It began to hum, vibrating at a frequency that made the chitinous plates of his chest armor ache. Vex looked down into the gap and saw thousands of lidless, shifting irises staring back from the subterranean dark. The human male did not slide. He stood perfectly upright on the slanting steel, his civilian boots anchored to the metal as if the planet's pull had chosen to obey him. He reached down into the crack, his bare fingers brushing against the largest, oldest iris as it rose through the water to meet his palm. The ancient mass pressed against his hand like a tame beast seeking its handler. The most powerful empire invaded Earth, and it turned into the worst mistake in space history because the invaders had just broken the cage. I wish I could tell you the containment held after that day. It did not. Stay close. 3 hours before the descent, the tactical bridge of the flagship was still silent. Vex stood under the white illumination grid, watching the blue-green world turn in the viewing screen. Clouds drifted over oceans. Ice capped the poles. Cities glittered across the night side like scattered diamonds, showing no signs of defensive energy nets or orbital combat frameworks. The Imperial data streams classified the target as a baseline primitive society. Sub-Commander Ith pressed her primary hands together, her skin shifting to a light yellow hue. She reported 17 orbital frames, all of them built from basic crude metals. The surface defenses relied entirely on ancient chemical propulsion to throw small rocks wrapped in radiation. Vex let his lower hands relax. The High Command had sent 50 dreadnoughts not to wage a campaign, but to deliver a swift punishment. 3 cycles earlier, a minor scouting vessel had crossed into the outer lines of this system. The humans had destroyed it with a single fast kinetic block, offering no negotiation before the hit. The Empire could not tolerate such defiance from a species that had barely learned to walk off its own dirt. Vex touched his control panel, opening a global broadcast channel on every frequency. "People of Earth," Vex said, his voice carrying the weight of an architecture that had never known a retreat. "You have destroyed a piece of the Empire. This act demands immediate payment. You will disarm your orbital platforms, surrender your command lines, and accept our governance. You have 1 standard hour to comply, or we will leave your surface empty." The communication array did not freeze with standard compliance codes. It crackled with a low-level response from a single human voice. The speaker sounded entirely unbothered, using simple words that lacked any military formality. "We have logged your mass," the human said. "Tell us, Commander, how many conscious minds are riding inside those metal hulls? We have been waiting a long time for someone to show up, and we are very hungry." The link died before Ith could trace the source. She turned to Vex, her skin turning an absolute white as she worked her console. The fleet commander ordered the bombardment wave to execute 10 minutes ahead of schedule. He wanted the surface reduced to ash before the local nations could organize their primitive interceptors. The 50 dreadnoughts aligned their forward batteries, executing a synchronized firing solution that could crack a continent. Massive bolts of superheated plasma fell toward the primary industrial hubs of the Northern Hemisphere. The weapons never touched the ground. A heavy energy net flickered into existence across the upper stratosphere, drinking the plasma like water hitting hot stone. The meters showed 0 damage, 0 heat bleed, and 0 structural decay on the surface. Its fingers flew across her display as she checked the power signatures. She reported that the planetary shield was generating rift space energy conversions that did not exist in any Imperial library. It was a capability that required a species to master advanced power containment centuries before developing star travel. The screen showed the net holding, and then it showed the mountain ranges breaking open. Angular, jagged hulls rose directly from hidden continental hangars built into the crust. They bore no flags or traditional military insignia. The lead human ship accelerated toward the vanguard at speeds that should have torn its frame apart, ignoring the known limits of mass and inertia. Vex ordered all forward batteries to isolate and target the vessel. A wall of plasma thick enough to vaporize a moon crossed the void, but the human ship did not turn or dodge. It simply altered its vector at a sharp perpendicular angle without slowing down, leaving the energy bolts to pass through empty space. Before the automated counters could adjust, the Terran ship returned fire, launching simple mass drivers toward the flagship. The first heavy driver round struck the forward shielding, and the entire energy barrier collapsed into static. The second round tore cleanly through the primary hull, venting atmosphere into the vacuum. Alarms screamed across 20 decks as the ship lurched violently toward the clouds. Ith shouted over the noise, reporting that the rounds were generating localized spatial tears upon impact, ripping holes through reality itself. Vex gripped his command rail as the flagship began its long fall toward the ocean basin below. Through the viewing screen, he saw the block letters painted across the bow of the human attacker, Harvester. A secondary transmission broke through their internal speakers, carrying the same level voice from before. "You should have read the fine print on that ultimatum," the human said. "We do not surrender, we collect." Around the falling flagship, the rest of the armada was dying in silence. The Terran ships moved through the formation like predators through a helpless herd, isolating individual cruisers and cutting their power lines. One Imperial captain sent an automated surrender request, but the humans did not acknowledge the signal. They kept firing until the remaining vessels broke their lines and fled toward the outer system. The flagship struck the shallow coastal waters with a force that shattered the remaining lower decks. Vex survived the impact inside the reinforced bunker room, surrounded by 36 officers who had formed a defensive ring around the emergency hatch. The environmental arrays struggled to filter the planet's heavy air, filling the compartment with the bitter smell of sulfur-based coolant. The heavy door did not explode. The locking mechanisms simply clicked, sliding open as if the system had chosen to obey an outside touch. A human male walked into the ruined room. He wore no armor, carried no visible weapons, and stood at an average height, looking at the officers with completely empty eyes. Vex raised his secondary plasma pistols, pointing them directly at the man's chest. "You are alone," the commander said, his upper limbs twitching. "Stand down, or we will vaporize what is left of you." "There are 38 of you in this room," the human said, his breathing perfectly steady. "I had to clear a path through more than 100 of your soldiers to get down here. I counted them because I wanted to remember what it felt like. It does not feel like anything anymore." Ith fired her weapon from the side. The plasma bolt crossed the narrow space in a millisecond, aimed straight for the human's throat. The man did not slide away. He raised his open palm, catching the superheated bolt in his bare fingers. The energy did not burn his skin. It hung in his hand for a second, a small sphere of captured light, before his fingers closed around it and swallowed it whole. The officers stood entirely frozen, their weapons lowering as their minds failed to process the inversion of their technology. The human stepped closer, his boots crunching against the wet metal plates. "We did not build our ships to fight your empire," the human said, looking at Vex. "We built our entire civilization to keep the deep ones asleep. We fought our own small wars, burned our own flags, and made our own noise for thousands of years just to give them a constant feast of pain. We had to keep them satisfied so they would stay in the dark." The floor plates buckled again as the fissure widened into the deep mantle. The thousands of eyes rose higher, their non-Euclidean structures displacing the air with a pressure that made Vex's ears pop. The human knelt by the edge, his skin radiating a heat that felt too warm against the damp air of the bunker. "But your big ships came and killed more of us in 1 hour than we had lost in a generation," the human said. "You gave them a massive feast of sudden death, and now the cage is completely broken. They are not just going to eat this dirt. They are going to follow your path back to the stars." Vex felt the absolute truth of the warning in his bones. He looked down into the abyss, his skin locking into a flat, matte slate gray, the terminal frequency of complete resignation. He turned to Ith and ordered an immediate retreat of every remaining ground asset. They had to leave the system before the threads could reach their warp corridors. The 31 surviving vessels broke through the system boundary after a frantic 3-hour sprint through real space. When the flagship finally re-entered Imperial territory, Vex requested an immediate audience with the High Council. He stood before the 12 in the Grand Chamber, presenting his sensor logs and detailing the entity beneath the Terran crust. Grand Admiral Tor leaned forward on his throne, his own skin shifting through deep blues of total amusement as he laughed at the report. He dismissed the logs as the panic of a broken commander who had been outmaneuvered by a primitive Deathworld species. Tor slammed his hand against the console, ordering a secondary deployment of 500 capital ships to return and burn the planet to ash. "Nothing can stand against the full might of our armada," Tor said, his colors hardening into a dark red of complete contempt. "We will bring back their ruins as a marker of our supremacy." "You are making the final mistake," Vex said, stepping back from the throne line. "The humans tried to warn us. If you go back, the Deep Ones will follow the noise, and there will be no one left to feed them." The Council did not listen. Their second deployment never reached the target system. Within 17 days, the abyssal threads crossed the void between stars, arriving at the core sectors in absolute silence. They did not fire plasma cannons or launch kinetic drivers. They simply hovered above the Imperial planets, consuming every memory, identity, and thought from the living minds below. Vex watched from the outer coordinates of the system as the capital world went dark. The purple cities remained physically whole, the great towers stood tall, and the massive starships drifted through the lanes without a scratch. But every crew was silent, and every mind had been scrubbed into a completely empty void. The undefeated Empire had vanished in less than 3 weeks, leaving only the quiet structures behind. A final unencrypted transmission from Earth reached Vex's terminal as his ship turned toward the deep frontier. The human keeper stood at the lip of his fissure, his voice echoing through the dead static of the sector. "Find the other surviving species," the human said. "Build a new watch across the border lines. Learn to maintain the small conflicts and the controlled noise before the dark reaches your new homes. It is the only life that outlasts the night." Vex closed his communication array, looking out at the distant stars that still held light. He keyed the navigation grid, setting a course for the nearest trading alliance to deliver the warning. Behind him, the fleet drifted like thousands of dead glass panels, and the silent towers of the capital stood cold under the empty sky.